for our audience with visual disabilities. This conversation is taking place between two people over video conference. At left is a woman with brown hair, Enis Fox-Schauffner, and at right is a woman with black hair, Dr. Olivia. Mrs. Fox-Schauffner is sitting in front of a blue curtain, while Dr. Olivia is in front of an artificial office background.
Welcome to AIR4VR Counselors. I'm Dr. Olivia. Thank you for joining us. The focus of today's conversation is on working with an interpreter. Our guest to help us explore this topic is the state qualified ASL interpreter, Enis Fox-Schauffner. Enis, welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us about your work as a sign language interpreter.
I work as a state qualified sign language interpreter. I work in the state of West Virginia, northern West Virginia primarily. I graduated from my ITP which is an interpreter training program, about 11 years ago. And since then, I've worked in the community, providing community interpreting services, as well as in the post-secondary educational environment, primarily providing interpreting services for deaf students in colleges and universities, and deaf employees at colleges and universities.
Okay, so tell us about your experience with working with adolescents and their families.
My experiences with adolescents and their families, basically I can speak to, in West Virginia, students that are deaf or hard of hearing either attend the residential state school for the deaf, which is in Romney, or they attend public schools or private schools in the area. Voc rehab counselors are going to be working with students that have attended all those types of schools. When you work with students in a residential school facility, typically parents are a little less involved because those students reside at the schools and only go home for like weekends and some holidays. And when you work with the students in the public school system, parents are going to be a lot more involved.
Okay. And then what would be the difference with students who would attend like a regular school where they wouldn't be in a residential program?
So with these students, some of the things that we see happen are sometimes parents are overly involved in the students' IEP processes through school. And we see this with students with all types of disabilities, not just deaf students. But we typically run into challenges that present because students aren't aware enough of their own disability. They're not aware enough of the accommodations that they need to be educationally successful. As such, some students fail to properly utilize the accommodations that are made available to them educationally. Some students make it all the way to the post-secondary educational environment and are not even aware that they have a learning disability that maybe is comorbid with their deafness. And so it's really important that parents and teachers and voc rehab counselors all work together to ensure that deaf students understand their disability. They understand the ways their hearing loss and their disability affects their educational processes. And then also that they understand how to advocate for themselves and what accommodations they need in the classroom, and then how to properly utilize those accommodations.
Okay, so building on you just mentioned VR counselors and the role that they play. What would you say, or what would you want VR professionals to know about working alongside somebody like yourself to make that the most effective and efficient process?
Well, some general tips for anyone who's working with a sign language interpreter when you haven't used one before. It's a good idea to always look directly at the deaf person and talk directly to them. Use first person language, so avoid using language like tell him this or tell her that. And then also just that you use your very natural speaking language. You don't want to speak in a more elevated or less elevated language than normal. You want to speak at your natural rate of speech. These things make it easier for the interpreter, as well as keep the flow of the conversation more natural, more organic.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense. I personally have not had the opportunity to work with an interpreter when working with clients, but I can see how if you're in the room, you might easily default to talking to the other person who is also verbally communicating and then leaving out the person who is receiving the services. So those are really wonderful tips. Any additional final words that you would want VR professionals to know just about, again, the world of ASL or just working with an interpreter?
Yes, there are so many things. First, whenever you're going to have an interpreter in the interaction, you should anticipate a longer appointment than normal. Interpreted conversations simply take a little longer than conversations that aren't interpreted. So if you typically block an hour for a meeting with a client, you may block an hour and a half or an hour and 45 minutes with a deaf client. Also, things that are really important are to provide written information ahead of time to the interpreter whenever possible. This would be especially important if you're going to, say, go over assessment results with a client. It would be really beneficial for the interpreter to have access to information about the type of assessment, what types of questions might have been on the assessment, or what the results might look like ahead of time. You should never ask the interpreter to censor information or to leave out anything. Just know that the interpreter is going to interpret all of the verbal communication and things that happen in the environment that are nonverbal too, like if a cell phone rings or if an alarm goes off, the interpreter is going to interpret that information. Other little tips are, if you have a group interaction, please ensure that everyone takes their turn with speaking and that people aren't speaking at the same time, just because it's impossible for an interpreter to interpret for two people speaking at the same time. Let's see, good eye contact is really important. Eye contact is important in deaf culture and important to deaf people. So if you maintain good eye contact with the deaf person, that's a show of being interested in the conversation, and also will help you to revert to the habit of looking at the interpreter. And I guess you should always stick with interpreters, hire interpreters who are qualified and certified. You can do this by ensuring that you have partnerships with good agencies in your areas. Good partnerships with solid agencies in your areas will also ensure that interpreters are available should you need someone, for something last minute. Speaking to that, you shouldn't ever try to find an interpreter last minute. You should, if you know you have an appointment with a deaf person, you should try to secure your interpreter at least a few weeks before the appointment. Interpreting services in some areas, especially more rural areas, can be hard to secure and can be time consuming. So you want to consider that. And let's see, there are so many more things I can talk about, I'm sure, but a good tip.
I have a question. Would you recommend that the professional reaches out and maybe like meet with the interpreter prior to the meeting with the client?
In some situations, it just depends on every situation. The answer is always, it depends. There may be situations where the interpreter would need to have more background knowledge about the client or their situation. In that case, it's important that you have those conversations with the deaf person present. There shouldn't be a time when the deaf person or the interpreter and the counselor meet separately, just because that doesn't foster a collaborative relationship with the deaf person. And then also, you should always keep the deaf person as the specialist. The deaf person is the expert in their situation and their, language choices and their life choices. So it's always important to involve them. But sometimes, yes, sometimes the interpreter can be benefited by knowing, the client's background history, or, and again, if those conversations happen, they should just happen with the deaf person present.
Okay, wow, those are great tips. Thank you so much for coming and having this brief conversation with us. And I hope that our listeners took lots of notes, because I think you gave some wonderful tips to help foster just a, successful collaborative relationship between VR professionals and sign language interpreters. So thank you so much, Enis, for your time.
Sure, no problem. Thank you.